So this is indeed my farewell presentation. In June 2011, upon my retirement from University College, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies in London, I gave an informal address to staff and students to mark my departure from contractual teaching and administrative duties. In July 2011, I was unexpectedly invited by Charles King, with the blessing of Angela Stent, to consider an offer to fill the position of visiting Ion Rațiu Professor of Romanian Studies at Georgetown for a year, an opportunity that I eagerly seized. What began as a 10-month appointment has extended to the present day. Over my 9 years as the occupant of this chair, I have been able to take advantage of its endowment. To Nicolae, Indre and Pamela Rațiu, I extend my heartfelt appreciation of their constant encouragement. Here at Georgetown, my work has been inspired by the leadership of Angela Stent and the support of her assistants down the years, Christina Watts, Dr. Benjamin Luring, and Wesson Radomski. My professional experience has also been enriched by the contact that I have had with many students who have taken my classes. My involvement in Romanian studies began in the mid-1960s with language and literature, and has, by natural progression, come to extend to history and culture as a whole. Detailed study over many years has interacted with experience. My teaching and research has drawn not only upon primary sources, but also on my contacts with dissidents, especially poets and critics, who emerged in the later stages of the Ceausescu regime. Not surprisingly, I became persona non grata to the regime in late 1988. After the revolution of 1989, this moral identification with a society, in the broadest sense, opened to me doors which were closed to most indigenous as well as Western inquirers. My research into the security apparatus and its connections with the political leadership reflect these experiences. That research has continued during my tenure of the visiting professorship. History is a subject that defines us all. It teaches us, but of course we do not always learn from it. To be ignorant of your past is to remain a child for the whole of your life. One of the most pernicious consequences of the communist regimes is the perverted image of the past that they left. Since 1990, new histories of former communist states have appeared. The approach taken by some of them is novel and of value. This is inevitable, but it does not mean that all histories written before the fall of communism are less valuable than those written after. It means simply that in the research and writing of history, there are no final results. The purpose of history is not so much the chronological recording of events, but rather the description and understanding of problems, description, definition and understanding, more than the detailed presentation of events. For although a perfect knowledge of the past is impossible, we can nevertheless reach a more advanced level of understanding. History means a process of continual reflection, of revision and revisiting of the past. History, in the broadest sense of the word, is revisionist. People and events are reappraised and reappraised again. There is nothing profound in this observation. This is the purpose of thought. The past is the only thing that we know or think that we know. All that humanity knows today springs from the past, and all human thought is built upon that which has gone before. In the words attributed to Albert Camus, I quote, "If absolute truth belongs to anyone in this world, it certainly does not belong to the man or party that claims to possess it." End of quote. What is given to us is the pursuit of the truth. In the spirit of every person lies that something which no other person, not even he or she, can understand, discover, or unravel. Romanians fret about their history. Often they have given more importance to opinion than to facts. The thoughts of Blaise Pascal come to mind. I say, the heart has its reasons, which reason does not know. Historical research has often been conducted with the aim of consolidating, of supporting the idea of a nation state, since only the nation state, it was argued, could offer the cultural unity in which its members could prosper intellectually and economically. Therefore, all those born to a culture must live under the same political roof. It is evident that the national history, the peculiarities of a nation, are values without which a culture cannot be understood. Nationalism thinks in terms of historical destinies, yet the distortion of the past for political ends vitiates the future to which many of the younger aspire. We cannot have the benefits of the present age if our sensibilities and intellectual means do not draw upon them. We cannot truly affirm a national identity if it is conceived in opposition to tolerance and embraces racism, which dreams of eternal contaminations transmitted from the origins of time. It was only after 1990 that this national historiography was challenged in Romania by a handful of historians, in particular by Lucian Boia. In doing so, Boia offered a paradigm for scholars in other parts of Europe to interrogate their own history and presentation of it. His book in Romania was the first serious attempt by a Romanian to discuss how the past had been distorted for political ends, especially during the period of communist rule, when the regime attempted to form its own version of history through manipulating accounts of the distant and not so distant past. Boia's refreshing interpretation of history and myth and the role they play in Romanian life has had a potent impact in Romania, especially upon the younger generation. His study was discussed widely in the Romanian press and in the broadcast media. In my courses at Georgetown, I sought to include the Romanians' experience of their past as one of the many case studies that I addressed. Those courses were The Devil in History, The Temptation of Fascism and Communism as a subtitle. A second course was Contested Territories and Divided Societies. A third, The Police State, Lustration and Transitional Justice, a comparative view. And the fourth, The Holocaust in Romania. The Devil in History takes its name from the Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski. He argued that communism and fascism represent two incarnations of the disastrous present of the devil in history. Both ideologies are seen as two sides of the same coin of totalitarianism. The course examined this perspective. It discussed the relationship between communism and fascism, the degree to which both have been formed into a nationalist ideology, and presented examples of a repression used in the application of both ideologies. The Romanian past offers example of the application of both ideologies. Finally, the course considered how far certain of today's communist regimes merit that label. Contested Territories and Divided Societies addresses areas of competing nationalism and discusses the manner in which the ideas of nation and democracy inform the government of selected multi-ethnic states and territories. It seeks to remind us that while the options offered under democracy offer the prospect of finding common ground on which to negotiate, thus carrying the seed of consolidation for democracy in certain states in transition, those same democratic options can complicate transition since they nurture the potential for dispute. The geographical focus in the course is principally, although not exclusively, on Kosovo, Moldova, Ukraine, and Transylvania as regions of national division, and examines how that division has affected both history and politics in these states. The course also examines a number of historical border disputes, those between Japan and Russia over the Kuril Islands, and between India and Pakistan regarding Kashmir. The focus of the police state, a comparative view on the coercive mechanisms of selected totalitarian authoritarian regimes. It tackles the question of to what extent and how democratic governments deal with the crimes and abuses of authoritarian predecessors, and to what degree certain states regard a reckoning with the past as an essential component of the sustainability of democracy. The course is divided into three parts. The first takes an historical approach and looks at forms of the police state in Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and certain countries of East Central Europe after World War II. The second considers the theory and practice of transitional justice, and the third examines the approaches to transnational justice taken in selective states, transitional justice taken in selected states, providing case studies that include, for a wider comparative dimension, the experience of South Africa under apartheid, Chile, and Argentina. Finally, the Holocaust in Romania examines the rise of the anti-Semitic Iron Guard after the First World War and the formalization of anti-Semitism into state policy in the 1930s. It discusses the drift of Romania into the orbit of Nazi Germany after 1936 and the intensification of anti-Semitic measures with the accession to power in September 1940 of Jan Antonescu in tandem with the Iron Guard. Antonescu's preparation for Romania's part in Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union involved the deportation of Jews from the country's eastern areas, culminating in the last pogrom of June 1941. This and the subsequent mass deportations of Jews from Bessarabia and Bukovina to Transnistria are examined. Conditions in the camps and ghettos are also described using official Romanian documents and survivors' accounts. What of the saliency of the past in Romania? It is illustrated by the celebration in December 2018 of 100 years since the proclamation of the Union of Transylvania with Romania. Nothing is guaranteed to charge Romanian and Hungarian emotions more violently than the subject of Transylvania, since the province is regarded by both Romanians and Hungarians as an integral part of their ancestral homeland. For many Romanians, the 1st of December 1918 marked the day when, to use the words of the Irish poet Seamus Heaney, hope and history rhyme. That rhyming was an echo of President Woodrow Wilson's address to the Congress of the United States on the 8th of January 1918, in which he proposed 14 points as a blueprint for world peace that was to be used for peace negotiations after World War I. Point 10 of his proposals was that, I quote, "the peoples of Austria-Hungary, whose place among the nations we wish to see safeguarded and assured, should be accorded the freest opportunity of autonomous development." End of quote. This point has been generally interpreted by historians as a call for self-determination. Point 14 called for the establishment of a world organization that would provide a system of collective security for all nations. This later point was incorporated into the Treaty of Versailles, and the world organization would later be known as the League of Nations. The enthusiasm with which the Union of Transylvania with Romania on the 1st of December 1918 was greeted is recounted by Nicolae Mergineanu, a high school student at Blaj in Romania at the time, who became an instructor in psychology at Cluj University in 1926 and was the first Romanian holder of a Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship in 1932. Here is what he wrote. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points were common knowledge. His conditions for durable peace included the right to self-determination for all subjugated peoples. A few weeks later, he's talking about 1918, the Hungarian language stopped being taught. And one evening, all of our students gathered in the cathedral square in Blaj and burned our Hungarian language textbooks, linking hands and dancing around a bonfire. I will never forget the song we sang, "Let us join hands, whoever is of Romanian heart." On the 1st of December 1918, the Grand National Assembly gathered in Alba Iulia and decided that Transylvania would join the motherland. End of quote. That the union of Transylvania with Romania should evoke such emotion is hardly surprising. The true identity of the Romanians in the province had been frequently denied, and attempts have been made to give them a new one in order to disguise their origin. After more than a century of such manipulation, it was only natural that the instinctive identity of the Romanians in Transylvania with their brothers and sisters across the Carpathians should have asserted itself in 1918. And in that assertion, the justice of the Romanians' right to exercise self-determination in order to correct what they considered to be the injustice of the suppression of their identity was self-evident. But the righting of that wrong ran the risk of creating new injustices against the minorities of the newly enlarged state created by the Paris peace settlement. The nation state of the dominant majority took the place of the empire of the dominant minority in the new post-First World War Europe. But in the redrawing of national frontiers, new minorities were created, and with them the seeds of new territorial disputes sown. This potential for upheaval was recognized by the great powers, who made their guarantee of new national frontiers conditional upon the protection for minorities. President Woodrow Wilson made this clear in a speech of the 31st of May 1919 at the preliminary peace conference in Paris. I quote, "We cannot afford to guarantee territorial settlements which we do not believe to be right and which we cannot agree to leave elements of disturbance unremoved, which we believe will disturb the peace of the world. If the great powers are to guarantee the peace of the world in any sense, is it unjust that they should be satisfied that the proper and necessary guarantee has been given? Nothing, I venture to say, is more likely to disturb the peace of the world than the treatment which might, in certain circumstances, be meted out to minorities." Those were the words of Woodrow Wilson in May 1919. For the protection of racial, linguistic, and religious minorities, treaties were signed by the powers with Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Greece, guaranteeing certain rights of education and worship and participation in the state bureaucracy. Almost identical provisions were introduced into the peace treaties with Austria, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Turkey, the defeated nations of World War I. However, no means of enforcing the treaties was established, and by the early 1930s, they were effectively meaningless. The new minorities of the post-1919 period, in their turn, were incensed with the Paris peace settlement for having been deprived of their former privileged status as part of a majority group. They now found themselves minorities. The Hungarians in Romania, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia, and the Germans in Czechoslovakia and Poland both belonged to this category. Portraying themselves as victims of Versailles, they campaigned against the peace settlement and vigorously defended their ethnic identity in the face of pressures to integrate them. By placing loyalty to their ethnic group above loyalty to the state, they invited discrimination, and when this inevitably occurred, they appealed to their mother states for assistance. In the cases of the German and Hungarian minorities, such assistance was more than readily given, since both Germany and Hungary considered themselves to have been grossly maltreated at Versailles and were bent on revision of the peace settlement. Thus, support of their minorities was soon translated by these states into encouragement of irredentism in an effort to destroy the European status quo. Not surprisingly, the host states of these minorities suspected them of being fifth columns in the service of a hostile power and regarded it as no accident that the largest number of petitions to the League of Nations on alleged minority abuses were presented by the Germans in Upper Silesia, followed by the Hungarians in Transylvania. President Wilson discovered during negotiations in Paris that his ideal of freedom of the national group was impossible. Excessive of national freedom, Wilson soon discovered to be an untrustworthy guide, incapable of universal application. Conflicting aspirations meant, for example, that the principle of self-determination, if applied in the Sudetenland, would contradict the premise of self-determination upon which the new state of Czechoslovakia had been based. In addressing this conundrum, Wilson invoked the application of the principle of justice. He wrote, "It must be a justice that seeks no favorites and knows no standards, but the equal rights of the several peoples concerned. No special or separate interest of any single nation or any group of nations can be made the basis of any part of the settlement which is not consistent with the common interest of all." End of quote. Yet, as proved in Paris, governments felt that justice to their own people required a protection of national security that often could only be achieved at the expense of another security. The union of Transylvania with Romania was confirmed by the Treaty of Trianon on the 4th of July 1920 as part of the Paris peace settlement. The award to Romania, the centenary of which was celebrated in Romania this summer, was based on the fact that 11 of Transylvania's 15 counties had a clear Romanian majority, totaling some 2.8 million persons. Thus, a 1,000-year Hungarian link with Transylvania was severed, leaving the province with a substantial Hungarian minority of some 1.6 million persons. Nicolae Mergineanu, whom I quote as one subject of my research, was born in the village of Abreja in central Transylvania on the 22nd of June 1905. I edited his autobiographical memoir, published with the title of Witnessing Romania's Century of Turmoil, Memoirs of a Political Prisoner, Nicolae Mergineanu, in 2017 at the University of Rochester Press in New York. It is a unique and invaluable addition to the literature in English on the experience of political prisoners, not only in communist Romania, but in authoritarian states in general. It graphically uses the author's incarceration between 1948 and 1964 to underline the arbitrary use of authority in communist Romania, and his courage in maintaining his moral integrity and dignity in the face of iniquity. But its appeal goes beyond his post-World War II suffering, for it also offers a wistful and civic account of episodes from the author's youth in the period between 1916 and 1980. Cloistered by the Romanian state in Transylvania after World War I, Mergineanu was able to develop his talents. He studied philosophy and psychology at the King Ferdinand University of Cluj and was appointed an instructor there in 1926. 3 years later, he gained a doctorate from his alma mater. There followed a string of postdoctoral bursaries abroad, at Leipzig, Berlin, Hamburg in 1929, in Paris in 1930, and in London in 1935. He was the first Romanian holder of a Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship and conducted research at Duke, Yale, Columbia, and Chicago in the period between 1932 and 1943. In the meantime, he was promoted to the chair of psychology at Cluj University. Amongst his publications in Romanian during these years were the psychology of exercise, contemporary German psychology, contemporary French psychology, analysis of psychological factors, and the psychology of the person. It was precisely Mergineanu's university studies in Western Europe and the United States that marked him out to the communist authorities as a potential opponent of the communist regime in Romania after World War II. With the imposition of communist rule in 1945, Romania was forced to turn its back on the West and face eastwards. In cultural terms, this meant that the Romanians' debt to the West could no longer be acknowledged, nor their links maintained. While conversely, the Romanians had sided with Russia in the past for the new ideological imprint to be given by the Soviet Union. Like many colleagues with a similar career, Mergeneanu found himself the target of the Western Allies' erstwhile partner, the Soviet Union, and its surrogate, the Romanian Communist Party. Contact with the West became a cardinal sin, with which such figures could be charged, tried, and removed. Mergeneanu's experience is emblematic of the fate of most of the intellectuals trained in the West during the 1930s, who were arrested and tried on the grounds of high treason against the communist state, even though credible evidence of such a charge was lacking. Mergeneanu became vice president of the Romanian American Association, set up after the coup in Bucharest of the 23rd of August 1944, in which the young King Michael, the pro-Nazi dictator Marshal Ion Antonescu. Mergeneanu's lectures praising the United States as a bastion of democracy and its contribution to the defeat of the Axis powers led to his arrest on the 14th of April 1948 and trial in September on a charge of high treason based on his alleged membership of a resistant movement to communist rule. The movement was, it was claimed, led by Max Auschnitt, a Romanian industrialist who had fled Romania in the summer of 1944 and eventually settled in the United States, becoming a friend of President Richard Nixon. Mergeneanu had never met any of the other persons indicted with him on the spurious charge, and in his memoir he describes the farcical background to the drafting of the trumped-up charge. He was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment, of which he served 16. A second son of Transylvania, to whom I have dedicated much of my research activity at Georgetown, is Iuliu Maniu, whose relations with the British are the subject of a 600-page collection of documents drawn largely from the British archive to Romanian colleagues and me, and published last month in Bible of History at Cluj University, and Otilo Varga, a researcher at the Institute of History in Cluj. During the Second World War, the military situation was never conducive to a defection strategy for Romania. Fear of the Soviet Union had driven Romania into alliance with Nazi Germany. A great-nephew of Simeon Bărnuțiu, one of the leaders of the 1848 revolutionary movement of Transylvanian Romanians and representative of the Greek Catholic wing, Maniu was born in 1873, attended a Greek Catholic elementary school in Blaj in central Transylvania and secondary school in Zalău, and went on to study in Vienna and Budapest, where he took a degree in law. On his return to Transylvania, he became a professor of law at the Greek Catholic Seminary in Blaj and legal advisor to the Metropolitan Bishop, that is the Greek Catholic Bishop. He joined the Romanian National Party of Transylvania, whose program focused on the establishment of Transylvanian autonomy and the assertion of Romanian rights, commensurate with the Romanian demographic majority in the province. In 1909, he was elected a deputy in the Hungarian parliament, where he was a powerful advocate of Romanian aspirations. After being called up into the Austro-Hungarian army in 1915, till June 1930, when Prince Carol had the end of a royal dictatorship was confirmed. On the 30th of March 38, a decree dissolving all political parties was issued and a strict regime of political censorship applied. Maniu's protests to Carol went unheeded, and he thus began what was to be a 6-year period as head of the opposition in Romania, one tolerated by Romania's pro-Nazi dictator Ion Antonescu. At this point, we should make it clear that we cannot talk about resistance in Romania either to the Antonescu regime or to his German allies in the same terms as in the case of France or Yugoslavia. The circumstances of Antonescu's accession to power, his maintenance of Romania's sovereignty during the period of alliance with Germany, and his pursuit of the war against a communist Russia, considered a predator, meant that any armed resistance to his rule was viewed by most Romanians as treachery. It followed from retention of sovereignty that a Romanian resistance movement must engage in resistance not against an occupying power, but in insurrectionary action against its own national government in conditions of hostility to such a movement itself. The resistance offered was small in scale. There were no organized resistance operations of the time conducted by the Maquis in France, or rather as an instrument of Soviet communism. This is not to dishonor the few Romanians whose anti-Axis convictions led them to undertake clandestine activities in favor of Allied and particularly British military intelligence, nor the handful of communists who carried out isolated attacks on the Romanian rail network designed to hinder the Axis war effort against the Russians. But there was no major public opposition within Romania to Antonescu's rules, only spasmodic letters of protest from individual Romanians. Resistance in the Romanian context meant political opposition, and that opposition was led by Maniu. It was manifested at two levels. First, the delivery of military intelligence to the British, and second, attempts to remind Antonescu of the cost of his alliance with Nazi Germany. In furtherance of these aims, wireless transmitters were placed with Maniu and his associates in the National Peasant Party in the period 1940-44 by the British and pro-Western Romanian and indeed Turkish agents. Maniu retained the pre-war image of Britain, colored by a belief in Britain's imperial might and an assumption that Churchill would contest at every step Soviet ambitions in Eastern Europe. The British did little to disabuse him of his view. When Antonescu was summoned to Germany after the German occupation of Hungary on the 19th of March 1944, Mihai Antonescu, the deputy to Ion Antonescu, but no relative, sent a message to the British via Istanbul asking what Allied help Romania could count on. General Wilson, the commander-in-chief of the Middle East, responded by urging the Marshal not to visit Hitler and to order his troops to cease resistance to the Red Army. Antonescu he was told by Wilson on a determination to overthrow the Antonescu regime and that powerful air attacks will be directed against targets indicated by Maniu. But the sentence in the cable, which I quote, "No land assistance can be given from this theatre," was removed from the cable by the British Foreign Office, thereby laying the seeds of misunderstanding between Maniu and the Western. Maniu did not enjoy the enthusiastic favour in parts of the British Foreign Office. His attempts to reconcile his trust of the Soviet with the Soviet Union in military occupation of much of Central and Eastern Europe. Their thoughts turned to damage limitation, but without an effective lever of sanction, apart from the military operation, which no senior politician in the weight of a long war was prepared to countenance, they were reduced to the role of spectators in the Soviet colonization of the region. Yet, in the eyes of many in Eastern Europe, the West had compromised its own principles. By failing to honor the pledge in the Declaration on Liberated Europe, made at the end of the Yalta Conference in February 1945, to foster the conditions in which the liberated peoples may exercise the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they would live. Britain and the United States gave the appearance of legitimacy to which Churchill called himself force and misrepresentation. It was this failure which damaged the West most in public opinion in the eastern half of Europe in the post-war period. At the beginning of this address, I stated that one of the most pernicious consequences of the communist regimes is the perverted image of the past that they left. The collapse of communism has allowed a restoration to history of those figures who, like Meniu, have been victims of the misrepresentation. It is my hope that the Rațiu visiting chair will continue that process of continual reflection, of revision, and of revisiting of the past. Thanks for listening in.
A brilliant tour d'horizon, and for enabling us to get an insight into much of your research. I also want to recognize and welcome and thank Nikolai Rațiu, who has joined us from London again, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the very generous donors who has enabled us to have Dennis with us since 2011, and that was my mistake. But I'm glad you corrected me, Dennis. So if anyone would like to raise a question for Dennis Deletant, please, if you can use the chat function. Dennis, what's your next area of research? What's your next project?
I'm working at the moment on a book on Romania between World War I and World War II. Part of the research I've carried out, or have been carrying out, at the National Archives in Washington, and in our pre-lecture talk, those were that was the research, or some of the documents I was referring to at the moment being in isolation here in London. I can't get access to them, but there are plenty of secondary sources, excellent secondary sources that refer to the interwar period, and I've been rereading them. So that's been a great help in providing a framework for my next project.
Great. Yes, we understand that your documents are in lockdown in your apartment in
DC, yes,
in DC area, which is too bad. All right. This is a question I have for you from Jennifer Long. Thank you so much for your talk. I wonder if you could address what surprises you about what has and has not changed in Romania over the period you have studied the country.
What has surprised me most, in a very positive sense, is the activity of young Romanian historians, most of whom are free from the ideological constraints which affected the writing of history before 1989 in Romania, and also their willingness, I think, to challenge the pre-1989 accounts of the past. A number of them whom I've been in contact with since I'm involved with a couple of the Romanian institutes of history, and I've helped these scholars as they've made their way into positions in the historical institute. So it's a two-way thing. They're able to keep me up to date with their, I at the same time feed them materials that I've found in the archive. I found that they're, as I said before, much more willing to accept challenges to their viewpoints, if indeed challenges are merited, whereas some of my friends from the older generation, let's say, are more loath to take on board the new scholarship. I don't want to generalize too much, but to answer the question, yes, I'm very positive about the role of historians, young historians in Romania, and indeed the role of social media in Romania, which has seen a massive explosion. The fact that the general public in Romania now can access papers online, can access the type of recording you are now making at Georgetown on my talk, and also the fact that they can access YouTube, various podcasts. This leads to a broadening of their horizons and is reflected very much in what they write.
Great. Next question is from Professor Michael David Fox. Can you reflect on the current state of the field of the Romanian Holocaust, which you've contributed to?
The study of the Holocaust has been promoted very much in Romania by the Elie Wiesel Institute for the study of the Holocaust. As I'm on the advisory board of that institute, I have a fairly detailed knowledge of the publications made by members of the institute, the research projects that are underway. There is still, sadly, an element in Romanian society that refuses to accept the evidence that the work of the Elie Wiesel Institute has produced, and indeed the work of scholars in institutes throughout Romania that deal with the Romanian past. So for me, the Elie Wiesel Institute, other scholars of Jewish background in Romania do a public service by giving access through the secondary works that they produced, and indeed sometimes by putting documents online to the sufferings of the Jewish community down the centuries in Romania. And I'm, as I was just saying, very much involved in helping those scholars if they ask for my help, because my own research, as you pointed out, Angela, has involved a study of Romanian language documents here in DC, in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which has a splendid collection of Romanian language documents provided down the years by the Romanian government, which enables scholars outside Romania to also access primary source material on the Holocaust in Romania.
Thank you. Here is a question from Professor Charles King, first Ratiu professor. What are the prospects for continued cooperation among Romanian, what are the prospects for continued cooperation among Romanian and Hungarian historians over contentious parts of their shared history, given the political trends in Hungary that we see today?
There's been quite a level of cooperation between Romanian and Hungarian scholars, works that have appeared by scholars, Romanian and Hungarian scholars at the Central European University in Budapest, and some of those scholars are moving to Vienna now. So we have published works by scholars of both nationalities, but also the documents, for example, the collection of documents I referred to at the Varga is a Hungarian scholar who collaborated both with George Ciprianu, a Romanian scholar, and with me. So there's a triangle really of interethnic collaboration there. And indeed with Ottilo and with another German, Hungarian, Romanian scholar, Ottmar Trashka of the Institute of History, including we are working on another volume of document is to publish what is known as the War Diary of the Special Operations Executive. So there's more than 600 pages of this War Diary which we are editing, and we will of course provide an introduction to the chapters of the focusing pages in the diary. We're focusing very much on Romania as a target of the British Special Operations Executive between 1950 and 1945. Can you hear me still?
We can. You are fading in and out. Things get worse in the afternoon, everybody. I have another question, unfortunately, because I think everyone's tuned in. I have another question for you. Your study of Romania has been an excellent case study of the power and legacy of nationalism. As nationalist populist movements continue to gain strength in Eastern Europe and worldwide, what would you say is, I'm sorry, this is, my chat thing is, what would you say is the most poignant lesson of the interwar period and Romanian fascism and communism that our generation must keep in mind to prevent the tragedies of totalitarianism and violence returning?
I think the present generation, the younger generation, has the advantage of being able to access social media, where we have such a multitude of differing opinions is there, and people, I think, can learn from the very vivid debates that go on today about the role of nationalism, this drift towards what we might call national populism. But going back to the 1930s, what I think is tragic for me, especially in the case of Romania, is the very negative role of the church in Romania's affairs. Instead of being a beacon of Christian tolerance and understanding, see that elements in the Orthodox Church gave quite strong support to fascist movements in Romania, and that gave a legitimacy in the eyes of many young people in the 1930s to fascist movements, and of course the anti-Semitic propaganda of those movements. So for me that was very poignant and something which disturbed me, especially when I was reading primary source documents from the 1930s, which were drawn up by the Romanian secret police at the time, Siguranța. They were very open about reporting the the very negative influence of the Romanian Orthodox Church on the public in villages in particular, in inculcating, in promoting anti-Semitic thought.
Thank you. Another question. You mentioned historian Lucian Boyer and his contribution to the understanding of Romanian's history. Given the recent revelations regarding his collaboration with the Securitate, could you give us a sense of his current reception in Romania?
Could you just repeat the last part of the question, Angela? I didn't get it.
Sure. So the historian Lucian Boyer,
yes,
given the recent revelations regarding his collaboration with the Securitate, could you give us a sense of his current reception in Romania?
Yes, I think he's looked upon now very negatively because of the revelations regarding his alleged collaboration with the Securitate. Of course, he's not the only figure who, with the opening of the Securitate archives, has been exposed as someone who collaborated in one form or another with the Securitate. So that certainly has damaged his reputation.
Thank you. So, and here is a question from Ross Johnson. It's one that I've often wondered about too. Is there evidence that Ceausescu thought the West's support of his autonomous foreign policy in the Soviet bloc gave them a freer hand to increase domestic repression?
Yes, I think, well, I thank Ross for that question. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and I say anecdote, I'm speaking on the basis of my own conversations with senior figures in the Romanian Communist Party post 1990, of course. But it's pretty clear from the evidence that we have that Ceausescu counted very much on the Western perception of him as a thorn in the side of the Soviet Union, and therefore he was going to milk that particular cow, if I can use that analogy, to his advantage. And of course, if we look at the fact that Ceausescu was the only Soviet bloc president to be invited to the United States, not just once, but 3 times. No other communist leaders had a state visit, 3 state visits to the United States in such a short period of time. So Ceausescu was understandably enamored of the, one might also almost say adulation. Perhaps adulation is too strong a word, but at least the very benign view that was taken, not just in Britain, in the United States, but in Britain. Of course, he had a state visit in July 1978. In France, in the same year, he went just before July to Paris, and this review that could get away a very coercive domestic policy by focusing very much on the foreign policy, external policy that he pursued really, I would say, up until 1985. Of course, he was undermined by the appearance of Mikhail Gorbachev in March 1984, which effectively made, in Western terms, Ceausescu irrelevant.
Thank you. We have a question now from Paula Ganga, and yes, with your decades of experience, what would be your advice for young historians focusing on Romania? What do you see as some of the fruitful avenues for future research into Romania's past?
There needs to be, in my view, a greater focus really on, first of all, some aspects of Ceausescu's policy and the economic aspects. What did the West do in general, and Britain included, do to encourage Ceausescu's own particular view of foreign relations, his relations with the Soviet Union, his relations within the Warsaw Pact, because it's, I think, it's often overlooked, or often overlooked is the fact that he, in many respects, he effectively, from the late 1970s, pursued an autonomous policy within the Warsaw Pact. Of course, he remained a member, but he did not always participate in the consultative political meetings of the Warsaw Pact. So that's a very interesting aspect that deserves further investigation. In fact, some work on that in that field has already been done by an American scholar, Larry Watts, and I found those particular works, his particular study, but of course that doesn't mean to say we should overlook the repressive aspects of Ceausescu's regime, and more work needs to be done, I think, in English, published in English, about the deep repression that took place in Romania after the imposition of communist rule in 1945, and the suffering. I refer to a Professor Mărgineanu, Nicolae Mărgineanu. If you think that he spent 16 years in jail because of his views on the United States, not for any subversive acts that he actually in a concrete form carried out against the communist regime. And remember that it was not only intellectuals who suffered at the hands of the communist regime, but the peasantry. Gheorghe Dej, Romania's leader in 1961 in a speech in Constanța, recognized that 80,000 Romanian peasants were sent to labor camps between in the early 1950s. I can't remember the exact words of Gheorghe Dej, but it was testimony by the leader of the communist regime himself to the repression that had taken place to the younger generation in Romania about the suffering that their parents' generation went through.
Thank you. We have two more questions. The first is from Teodor Stan, a graduate of our program some years ago. Nice to see you. He says some very complimentary things about your work. His question is, what are your thoughts about the nature of cultural Romanian belonging and solidarity in the current context of mass migration?
I think mass migration is not just a feature of the present day, but if we think of Transylvania, for example, there was mass migration in the early part of the 20th century to the United States from Transylvania. Transylvania and Romania in general was a major source of immigration into the US at the beginning of the 20th century. So it's not a new phenomenon. What is, I think, very different regarding the mass migration today is the fact that people can travel much more easily. Indeed, we've seen in the last 3 or 4 weeks during the corona virus pandemic that 150,000 Romanians working in Italy have returned to Romania. Now, of course, that has brought economic problems, difficulties to Romania in that these people have come without work. They've lost their jobs. Largely, they want to be at home during the pandemic rather than being in Spain or Italy. But it does show that I'm sure once the pandemic passes or eases, we will find Romanians returning to other countries in the European Union, but not necessarily settling there. There will be this constant toing and froing between Romania and other countries, which has been a feature of Romania, was a feature up until World War II of Romania itself in the early 19th century. Large, as I say, a lot of movement in and out of Romania by Romanians up until 1939.
Thank you. And the final question follows on really from that, from Kathleen Smith, our colleague at CERES. How do you see Brexit influencing British-Romanian relations?
I don't think it will have a major impact, A, because Britain needs Romania's agricultural workers, and we've seen how many Romanians have begun to come back to the UK despite the pandemic. And secondly, what is interesting is that more than 500,000 Romanians settled in the UK have applied for residence in the UK, which shows that they're thinking of in terms of spending more time in Romania. So I can see in the long term a strengthening of British-Romanian relations, despite Brexit. Of course, they've been punctuated by the problems that the virus has thrown up, but I think the links that have been forged even before Britain joined the European Union, the fact that Romanians came as tourists in considerable numbers to the UK, that movement was consolidated by Britain's entry into the European Union and then by Romania's entry, of course, in 2007. So I see a positive development. If I can add here, just on a personal note, the sales of my book, Colloquial Romanian, which I've continually updated, which was first published in 1981, they rise every year. And I don't know, I don't think it's British people necessarily buying the book. Of course, Americans have bought it as well. But I've been told by the publisher it's many Romanians in Romania who use it in order to improve their English. So I'm very grateful to the Romanians in general.
Well, that's not too many professors can say that a book written so long ago is still that the sales are rising.
Yeah.
I'm just very sorry that we can only raise a virtual glass of champagne to you, but we're not going to say goodbye. We're going to say au revoir, because you'll obviously have to come back.
Come back, yes.
To get all your documents. But more, more generally, we hope that you'll visit us on the Georgetown campus. We thank you very much for this great lecture today, and for all that you've done for CERES in the Rațiu professorship. And we wish you obviously much success in your next research endeavors. So please joining me in virtually thanking Professor Deletant for a great lecture. Thank you.